Hello, my name is Erica, and I'm the Dyslexic Trekkie. Before I get started, I'd like to welcome all the new subscribers. Your interest really helps out, and Ensign Bradbury has agreed that for every 100 subscribers, he'll let you all hear one of his kitten's logs. When I chose this topic for my Pride special, the political attack on the trans community hadn't started. I had my video topics selected going out almost a year in advance, but given the anti-trans laws being passed throughout the US, I couldn't think of a more appropriate subject. I remember in my 20s talking about this subject with a friend of mine who was the editor for a local queer magazine. He, his partner, and a close friend were all Trekkies like myself. I remember him saying he thought it was a weak representation because there's no actual queer people in the story. The writers had to turn a story of conversion around in such a way as to make all the primary characters straight. Will gets involved with a person who identifies as a woman. She's a threat because her society wants to make her non-binary. My response was to say it forced people to play the part of what it was like to be gay in society. The interesting part to me is I don't think that was the intent at all. It was just a side effect of making a story about LGBTQ conversion that would make it past the censors and production. Regardless, until DS9, Outcast was the only overt story created to represent queer issues, at least the only one produced and aired. And this is where I personally believe the real issue with Outcast comes in. For the times it was created, Outcast is a well thought out story about the pain caused when someone has to hide who they are and then be forced to change for the acceptance of their society. For those who haven't watched my other revised series, I'll outline the rules for this project. First, I cannot make changes that change the outcome of the story. I cannot make changes to the story that will change the outcome of future stories. In essence, if a fight happens, it has to happen. If the character dies, they have to die. If the character lives, they have to live. In this case, if a procedure happens, it has to happen. In the case of Outcast, the first point I have to look at is what the actual issue with the story is. Scientifically, we know that conversion therapy is little more than torture, and in many cases, it's in fact torture. It includes pain aversion treatments, trying to associate physical pain to the sexual stimulation to their own gender. It can also include praying for days on end without breaks for sleep. The effects it has on reducing the number of queer members of society is by leading to higher numbers of suicide. In essence, it's a culling of queer people. But unfortunately, at the time of this episode, research said differently. Dr. Robert Spitzer had used a survey method to determine if ex-gay conversion therapy worked. By the results at the time, he concluded it did. I could go into detail as to why this method was faulty, but it all basically boils down to people with a vested interest in saying something does work will say it does. These were people whose lives revolved around the fact that they were no longer gay. Even though the participants were left unnamed, they had families and lives they could lose, including jobs and children, if they hadn't been made straight. Later, in 2012, he admitted the flaws in his study and stated that it could not be effectively used to show that conversion therapy is effective. By the time Outcast was created, the writers could only use the information known. The interesting point in the story is, even with the aliens' gender conversion working, it still causes pain and loss. So, what is there to change in Outcast? Well, the biggest issue with Outcast isn't with the episode itself, but rather the isolation in queer representation. There's no way to effectively show the dynamics of such a diverse community in one episode. Imagine if Star Trek had devoted only one episode in over 30 years to racism. There's no way they could do it proper justice, but that's the burden Outcast had to carry when it was released. So, the first change I would make would be to add a regular or semi-regular character who's queer. But how can that be done while still maintaining the rules for the revised series? I'd have to choose a character whose part wouldn't change effectively with such an adjustment. My first thought was Tasha Yar. She leaves the show early enough that her sexuality wouldn't play as much of an impact, and being a woman in a more classically masculine role would fit into the social norms of the time. The issue is her encounter with Data. If she were bisexual or pansexual, I don't think it would change much, but the issue goes back to how short of a time she's on the show. As cool as Tasha was, her character isn't very well developed, and there's not a lot of time in series for her story to be developed. We know she's from a failed colony, and that she saw Picard as a father figure. I think if more airtime had been given to her for moments to come up, she would be a perfect candidate. There could be a simple moment when she talks about past dating prospects, and male and female names are mentioned. That's all it would take. at least today. Anyone else notice that Strange New Worlds has made Nurse Chapel bisexual? It's so casual, unless you were primed to do so, you wouldn't notice. But it was the 80s, and people would have noticed, and an issue would have been made. Not to mention, if TNG had given that airtime to Yar, then Denise Crosby might not have left the show. That had been part of her issue. So, who's left? I considered Riker, given he's the one who falls for Soren, but I don't think it fits with the rest of his depiction on TNG. A bisexual Riker wouldn't make too much of an issue overall, but where were his boyfriends over the years? Unlike Yar, I can't see Riker keeping relationships quiet. So I think it would have to be someone who has no compunctions about talking on such things, but someone whose exploits wouldn't be seen on the show. To me, that leaves only one member of the crew, and that's Guinan. I actually had an argument over this with my sister when I proposed the idea. I'm not saying it's a perfect fit. She says she's been married 23 times. She's never specified that all of her spouses were men. Her insights during the shows and movies wouldn't change, and there's plenty of moments that wouldn't have changed the show while adding that layer to the story. In essence, nothing changes in any episode with Guinan if she's bisexual. The question then becomes, why make the change then? That's a hard one to explain to someone outside of the queer community. It goes back to parts of the queer culture going far back in TV time. The Hays Code made it illegal to show queer characters in a positive light. Any book that depicted queer characters could be considered porn, even if there were no sexual acts in the story. Think how hysterical Florida is right now because a teacher played a movie where a boy has a crush on another boy. By pornography laws, our existence was a sexual act. My speaking to you now on this subject was a pornographic act in their eyes. This meant the only time queer youth saw themselves in someone, they were a villain, someone who had to die a tragic death, or were a joke to be mocked. Having a character who was a positive influence on others, who clearly had happy, successful relationships that didn't end in tragedy, and was a person people went to for advice, could have made a huge impact on young people's lives. That's partly why it was illegal. It's also partly why the powers that be wouldn't allow it on Star Trek. The negative influence wasn't just our existence, but our productive contribution. Guinan, as a queer character, would have thrown that idea out the airlock, and when the time came for Will to try and make something work with Soren, I could see Guinan working to help him through that as only she could. I could also see her giving him some solace when it didn't work out, maybe saying some line about how, even after all these centuries, some worlds still have primitive ideas on gender and attraction. So, is this a perfect solution to the issue with Outcast? As with Code of Honor, I don't feel I can fully say. Unlike there, I belong to the community whose representation is problematic. I am a member of the queer community, but the story is now decades old, and the issues relating to it have moved on. We now know conversion therapy is torture. We now know it doesn't work. We now have more true representation in Star Trek, though not as complete as it could be. That's a subject for another time, though. I'm not going to say there aren't issues with Guinan in this role. I'm sure that people have different candidates they'd select. We could also select an episode with a flatter storyline and add the layer to it of a queer romance in the junior officers. Perhaps one of Crusher's nurses wanting some advice for an impending date, or someone going on leave and talking about enjoying the view. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. Given the times we live in, it's both dangerous and more timely than ever. Before I go, I'd like to wish everyone a very happy and safe Pride. If you're in a place where things aren't safe for you, I hope you find some pride this month as well. I'd like to remind everyone that in a world that fights to deny our existence and puts our children in danger for their agenda, the bravest and most daring thing we can sometimes do is be authentically ourselves. Never more has the fundamental tenets of Star Trek been more important to remember. We can all find both peaceful and fulfilling coexistence. But if we have to, if there's no other way, we must be willing to fight back. Happy Pride. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any thoughts, feelings, or ideas, please share in the comments below. If you notice any spelling or reading mistakes in this video, please comment within the first week of posting for the chance to choose a future topic. Again, my name is Erica, and I'm the Dyslexic Trekkie. Regardless, until 1969. Ensign Bradbury has his hand on my chin. Has his chin on my hand. It's a very important place for him to rest. I think if more airtime had Vin Gibbon. I could see Ginen. Like, I haven't been watching this show.